Welcome to Mini Stories, where we will be listening to the story. A Love Story, Prescribed. Chapter 1, A New Beginning. The first day of my residency at St. Margaret's Hospital was a whirlwind. The smell of antiseptic, the sound of bustling nurses and doctors rushing through the hallways, the hum of equipment, it all combined to create a sense of urgency and tension that felt as though it permeated every corner of the building. It was all so overwhelming, yet exhilarating. I had worked for years to get to this point, through countless hours of studying, sleepless nights, and the endless rotations of medical school, and now, I was here, standing at the threshold of my career. I walked into the hospital lobby, feeling a knot form in my stomach as I mentally prepared myself for the day ahead. My first shift as a resident would be full of challenges. There were so many unknowns, new colleagues, new patients, and new responsibilities. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew it would be intense. I couldn't help but glance around, my nerves bubbling up as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The hospital was massive, with hallways that seemed to stretch for miles and rooms that never seemed to end. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the environment. Everything was white walls, white floors, white ceilings. It felt like I had stepped into a different world entirely. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had worked hard to get here. I had earned my place. The realization made me stand a little taller, feeling a sense of pride and determination. The first person I met was Dr. Melissa Lane, the attending physician who would be overseeing my residency. She was a tall, confident woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense attitude. When she introduced herself, I immediately knew she wouldn't tolerate mediocrity. She was tough, but fair, and from the moment we shook hands, I knew I was going to learn a lot from her. "Welcome to St. Margaret's," she said, offering me a tight smile. "It's going to be a challenging year, but I know you're ready for it. You've got the skills, now it's time to put them to use." Her words made me feel both encouraged and anxious at the same time. She wasn't the type to sugarcoat things, but I appreciated her directness. It meant I wouldn't have to guess what was expected of me. The first few hours were a blur of introductions, paperwork, and familiarizing myself with the hospital layout. I was assigned to the ER for the day, a place that had always fascinated me during my clinical rotations. There was something about the energy of the ER, how fast-paced and unpredictable it was, that both terrified and excited me. Every shift brought with it the potential for life or death decisions, and I couldn't wait to be a part of that action. As I walked into the ER for the first time, the reality of the job hit me. The room was filled with the sounds of beeping monitors, the rustle of nurses moving quickly between patients, and the frantic energy of doctors trying to manage it all. It felt like organized chaos. I was just one small part of this vast machine, trying to make a difference, trying to keep things from falling apart. My first case was a man who had been brought in after a car accident. His injuries were severe, and his vitals were unstable. I was assigned to assist Dr. Lane with stabilizing him, and the pressure was immediate. I had seen car accident victims in textbooks and case studies, but nothing could prepare me for the reality of it. The blood, the frantic calls for help, the sense of urgency, it was all happening in real time, and I was expected to keep up. Dr. Lane didn't give me a second to doubt myself. She barked orders, instructing me to start in 4, check his airway, and prepare for intubation. There was no time to hesitate. I did my best to follow her instructions, trying to stay calm under the weight of the situation. But in the back of my mind, there was a nagging thought, could I really do this? Could I be the one responsible for saving someone's life? It wasn't until later that day, after the patient had been stabilized and transferred to surgery, that I had a moment to catch my breath. I found myself in the hospital lounge, sitting on one of the worn leather chairs, trying to process everything I had just witnessed. My heart was still racing from the intensity of the ER, and I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. This was what I had signed up for, wasn't it? As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I caught sight of him, Dr. James Carter. He was standing at the doorway, talking to one of the nurses, his deep voice calm and authoritative. Dr. Carter was one of the senior surgeons at St. Margaret's, known for his skill and his reputation as one of the best in his field. He was a legend at the hospital, and I had heard countless stories about him from my classmates. He was known for his surgical expertise and his cool-headedness under pressure. He was also known for being something of a loner, focused solely on his work and not prone to making personal connections. He wasn't the type of man I expected to notice me, let alone pay attention. But there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he turned to continue his conversation with the nurse. I felt a flutter in my chest. It was stupid, I knew. I had just started my residency, and I needed to focus on my work, not on some infatuation. But there was something about him, his intensity, his quiet confidence, that made it hard to ignore. He wasn't the kind of man who wore his emotions on his sleeve. He was reserved, always professional. Yet, there was an air of mystery around him, a sense of depth that intrigued me. As the day went on, I found myself bumping into him more often than I expected. He would offer a word of advice here and there, always kind but never overly familiar. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but nothing more. He was professional, as always, but I could sense the intelligence and the warmth hidden behind his clinical demeanor. I tried to keep my focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to him. There was something about Dr. Carter that kept pulling me in, something that made me want to know more about him. Was it just admiration for his skill, or was it something deeper? I couldn't deny the chemistry between us, but I also knew that I couldn't let that distract me from my goals. I had worked too hard to get here, and I wasn't about to let a fleeting attraction derail my career. But still, I couldn't help but wonder, would I get to know the man behind the reputation? Or would he remain an enigma, always just out of reach? The next few days were filled with long shifts, grueling hours, and moments of self-doubt. The hospital was a constant challenge, and I was learning more than I had ever imagined. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear to me: this was just the beginning of my journey. And somehow, whether I liked it or not, Dr. Carter was a part of that journey now. Chapter 2: The First Encounter. I had barely settled into my role as a resident when I found myself in the ER, working on a particularly challenging case. A young woman had been brought in after a car accident, and she was in critical condition. I was doing my best to keep calm and assist the attending physician, but there was so much happening all at once that it felt like a blur. I was trying to place in 4 when I heard a voice behind me. "Dr. Ellis, you're doing fine, but let me take over here," the voice said. I turned around to see Dr. Carter, standing tall and composed as always. His eyes locked with mine, and for a brief moment, the chaos of the room seemed to fade away. He didn't say anything else, just took charge of the situation with an ease that made my heart race. I stepped aside, feeling a little embarrassed by how easily he took control. But as I watched him work, I realized there was a reason for his confidence. He was exceptional at what he did. His hands moved with precision, and his eyes never left the patient. The minutes felt like hours as the team worked on the young woman, but Dr. Carter remained calm and collected. After what felt like an eternity, we were able to stabilize her. He gave me a quick nod before walking away, leaving me feeling both relieved and flustered. I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him: respect, admiration, and something else that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Chapter 3: Getting Closer. The next few weeks were a blur of long shifts, never-ending rounds, and trying to keep up with the fast-paced life of a resident. Dr. Carter and I crossed paths a few more times, but he always seemed distant. It wasn't that he was unkind, but there was an air of professionalism that never wavered. I had heard rumors around the hospital about his private life, how he was focused solely on his career, never involved in any relationships, and kept to himself outside of work. Still, there was something about the way he looked at me when our paths crossed. It wasn't just the clinical gaze of a colleague. It was deeper, more meaningful. But I wasn't sure if that was my imagination running wild. One evening, I was sitting in the hospital lounge, exhausted from a long shift, when I heard a familiar voice. "Dr. Ellis, you look like you could use a coffee." I looked up to see Dr. Carter standing there with 2 cups of coffee in hand. He had a slight smile on his face, but it wasn't the stern expression I usually saw from him. "Thank you," I said, taking the cup from him. "I could definitely use one." We sat down at the small table in the corner of the lounge, and for the first time, I felt like we were more than just colleagues. We talked about everything: medicine, our backgrounds, the challenges of being a doctor. I was surprised at how easy it was to open up to him. It felt like he was listening, really listening, not just to what I said, but to who I was. "I've never seen you like this," he said with a smirk after I told him about a particularly difficult case I had handled earlier that day. "You're usually so serious in the ER. I guess I'm allowed to let my guard down sometimes," I replied with a small laugh. That conversation marked the beginning of something more than just a professional relationship. We started talking more outside of our shifts, occasionally meeting for coffee or walking around the hospital during breaks. The connection between us was undeniable, and with each passing day, I found myself thinking about him more and more. Chapter 4: The Turning Point. A few months had passed since that first coffee, and things between Dr. Carter and me had become more complicated. Our conversations had become deeper, more personal. But I still hadn't crossed that line. We hadn't addressed the chemistry between us. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to make a move. Then came the night that changed everything. We had just finished a particularly challenging surgery, a 12-hour procedure on a patient who had been in critical condition. We were both exhausted, covered in sweat, but still buzzing with the satisfaction of saving a life. As we walked out of the OR together, I noticed Dr. Carter looking at me differently. There was a tension in the air, something that hadn't been there before. "Kate," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's wrong?" He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. Then, without another word, he stepped forward and kissed me. It was slow at first, tentative, as if he was unsure whether I would pull away. But I didn't. I kissed him back, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The hospital, the patients, the stress, it didn't matter anymore. When we finally pulled away, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he confessed. I smiled, my breath still shaky. "Me too." Chapter 5: Navigating Love and Medicine. After the night Dr. Carter kissed me, everything changed, but not in the way I expected. There were no grand declarations, no sudden leaps into a whirlwind romance. Instead, we carefully and deliberately began to weave our relationship into the fabric of our daily lives. We were two doctors, two professionals, trying to maintain the high standards we had set for ourselves while navigating the complexities of being in love. The hospital was a world of constant motion, patients coming in and out, emergencies cropping up at all hours of the day, surgeries that seemed to stretch into the night. But now, it wasn't just the rush of saving lives that kept me on edge. It was the steady, underlying excitement of being with someone I cared about deeply, even if we were still cautious about how much we allowed the outside world to see. When we worked side by side, I could feel the unspoken connection between us. It wasn't just the way his hand brushed against mine when we moved past each other, or the quiet smiles we exchanged during rounds. It was the way we seemed to understand each other in a way no one else did. He was there when I needed him, steady and confident, offering support during the most grueling shifts. But there was also the challenge of balancing everything. The long hours at the hospital, the constant demand for our attention, and the pressure to perform at our best every single day. There were times when I felt the weight of it all, the exhaustion, the responsibility, and the fear that I might not be able to juggle it all. Dr. Carter, despite his outward calm, was no stranger to those feelings either. On one particularly grueling night, after a 16-hour shift in the ER, I found myself sitting in the lounge, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. My mind was too tired to process anything. I heard the door creak open, and without looking up, I knew it was him. He had that way of walking, measured, almost too calm, but when he was around, everything seemed a little less chaotic. "Long day?" Dr. Carter's voice was quiet but warm. I looked up at him, feeling the weight of my exhaustion in my shoulders. "You could say that. I don't know how much longer I can do this. It feels like I'm running on fumes." He sat down beside me, a comfortable silence falling between us. For a moment, I thought he might say something reassuring, something along the lines of, "You're doing great," or "You'll get through this." But instead, he simply sat beside me, his presence comforting in its quiet steadiness. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" I asked, my voice more vulnerable than I intended. "We give so much of ourselves to this. To saving others. But sometimes it feels like we lose a piece of ourselves in the process. His eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't Dr. Carter, the perfect surgeon. He was just James, someone who understood what it felt like to be stretched thin, to give everything and wonder if you had anything left to give. I've thought about that more than I care to admit, he said softly, his voice raw with honesty. But then I look at you, Kate. And I see the way you care for your patients, the way you keep pushing even when you're exhausted. And I know we're doing the right thing. It's not easy, but we make a difference. And that's enough. I blinked back tears, grateful for his words. It wasn't just that he was my partner, it was that he understood. He understood the toll that this job took on us both physically and emotionally. And somehow, that made everything seem a little more manageable. We make a good team, don't we? I said, smiling faintly. He chuckled, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture so familiar now. The best team. The rest of the evening passed in a comfortable silence, the quiet rhythm of our lives at the hospital settling around us. But as the days went on, I began to feel the subtle pressure of what we were building. We were no longer just colleagues. We had crossed a line that could change everything. And while there was a sense of thrill in that, there was also a fear that if anything went wrong, if anyone found out, it could jeopardize everything we had worked for. It wasn't the fear of losing our jobs that bothered me, it was the fear of losing him. Of this connection we had, of the life we had started to build together. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I questioned if this was the right path, if our relationship was a distraction from our responsibilities. And there were times when Dr. Carter seemed distant, lost in his thoughts, as if he were wrestling with the same uncertainties. But we didn't let it pull us apart. Instead, we talked. We communicated in a way that felt natural, no pretenses, no barriers. One evening, we found ourselves walking home together after another exhausting shift. The night air was cool, and the city lights flickered around us. We didn't speak much at first, content to simply be in each other's company. Finally, Dr. Carter broke the silence. Kate, I want to take this seriously. I want us to be more than just two doctors working together. But I know this isn't easy. I know what we're up against. I stopped walking, turning to face him. What do you mean? My heart was racing, unsure of what he was going to say next. I mean, I don't want to rush this, he said, taking a deep breath. But I also don't want to keep pretending that we're just colleagues. I care about you. More than I thought I could. And I know that being in a relationship while working together comes with its own set of challenges, but I'm willing to face them with you. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I care about you too, James. But I've been so afraid. Afraid of what people might think, afraid of how we can make it work. He smiled, a small but genuine smile that warmed my heart. We don't have to have all the answers right now, but as long as we're together, we'll figure it out. In that moment, I knew he was right. There would always be challenges, always be obstacles, but there was no one else I'd rather face them with than him. We didn't have to have everything figured out. We just had to keep moving forward, step by step, together. Chapter 6, A Future Together. A year later, after countless surgeries, late nights, and challenges, Dr. Carter and I were sitting together in his office, a cup of coffee between us. I've been thinking, he started, his gaze focused on his coffee cup. About us. About the future. I felt my heart flutter, unsure of where this conversation was heading. What do you mean? I asked, my voice tentative. I want to build a future with you, he said, his eyes meeting mine. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Kate. Will you marry me? I blinked, feeling the rush of emotions hit me all at once. He wasn't just my colleague, my partner in the ER. He was the man I had fallen in love with. And in that moment, I knew that everything we had gone through, the long nights, the challenges, the doubts, had led us to this point. I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes. Yes, James. Yes, I will. And just like that, everything fell into place. We had faced the challenges of the hospital together, and now we would face the future together, building a life not just as doctors, but as partners in every sense of the word. The end. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, like, comment, share and subscribe.